making sure I get everything ready. Okay. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our program, Civic Engagement Lexington Women's Visibility Banner Honoree and part of the LexSeeHer Speaker Series. My name is Matt Schumann and I am a programming librarian at Cary Library. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like today's event to you. Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Jessie Steigerwald is the president of LexSeeHer, an all-volunteer community nonprofit whose mission is to make women visible. Jessie is also a town meeting member from Precinct 8 and served on the school committee for 9 years. LexSeeHer has advocated for and gained approval for a new monument that will be the first to recognize Lexington women's contributions across time. LexSeeHer has also partnered with Lexington Girl Scouts to create the Women's Visibility Banners. This year, Cary Library hosted the 2022 honorees, including Victoria Buckley, Lotte Scharfman, who will be further celebrated today. So I'd like to now introduce Victoria Buckley, MS, OTRL, and CCAP. She's a psychiatric occupational therapist and master's level clinician with over 40 years of experience in mental health. She graduated from Harvard University, magna cum laude, with an undergraduate degree in psychology, and from Tufts University with a master's in occupational therapy. She's been a certified aromatherapy practitioner since 2016. Victoria is a town resident of 34 years, a town meeting member and chair of the Commission on Disability in Lexington. She's a passionate, tenacious, and ever-present advocate for the rights and inclusion of people with all types of disabilities, including physical, mental, sensory, and neurodiverse. Victoria is currently working at Brigham and Women's Hospital Emergency Room in a pilot program to improve behavioral health services, and she also works at HRI Brookline. Victoria has worked in many aspects of mental health services with adolescents and adults in outpatient day programs, state hospital, inpatient units, and private hospitals. Her treatment philosophy and her strong advocacy efforts emphasize personal empowerment, community integration, and development of maximal independence. She's an active member of mission trips to Uganda and Mexico to help children with disabilities. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Margaret Coppe. She joins us today. She's herself an exemplar of civic engagement, serving as a town meeting member, former member of the school committee, and is the convener in the League of Women Voters of Lexington, as well as the town's Democratic Committee. Margaret joins us today to share the story of LexSeeHer honoree Lotte Scharfman. Lotte served as president of the League of Women Voters of Lexington and the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. Lotte is credited with authoring the League's motto, "Democracy is not a spectator sport." Further, she was responsible for getting the Massachusetts Legislature reduced from the unwieldy size of 240 to the current 160. Ms. Coppe will discuss Lotte's contributions to our community and the Commonwealth, drawing from historical accounts and from remembrances of Lexingtonians who worked with Lotte. So now I'd like to hand it over to Jessie Steigerwald.
Matthew, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's joining us and those who are joining us perhaps via the recording. Thanks so much to Cary for partnering with us and making it possible for us to explore and celebrate many different women's contributions to Lexington. Just so everyone knows, the way we're going to do today is we're going to focus on Victoria, who was selected as one of our living legends this year in the 2022 partnership between LexSeeHer and Lexington Girl Scouts. And I will be interviewing Victoria. We will then shift to Margaret, who's going to provide really inspiring and exciting information about Lotte Scharfman and her life. And then we're going to kind of combine our two guests today, having some shared discussion, questions, and dialogue about civic engagement. And I can see on the screen, we have people who are here who are also very motivated by civic engagement. So I hope near the end of the hour, we're in kind of a community conversation about this and drawing on each other's experiences to help people who may be newer to Lexington or newer to civic engagement to understand how they too can become involved. So welcome. And Victoria, I'm delighted to see you here. Thank you for making time during the workday. Hello.
Hi.
So LexSeeHer is really inspired by this phrase, "something must be done." And I'm going to tell a quick story before we dive into the Q&A. On April 19th, 1775, a date many of us think of as the battle and the first shots fired in the American Revolution. On that morning, Jonathan Harrington was a teenage boy asleep in his bed. He was also the fifer for Captain John Parker. And he was sleeping in a little too late that early morning, and his mom called out, Jonathan, Jonathan, the regulars are out, something must be done. And this phrase, something must be done, was carried forward into the 20th century by women's suffragists in our community. This idea of seeing something, that knowing there's something that has to be addressed, and then deciding something must be done and taking action. Victoria, we'd love to turn back time a little bit and ask for you as a person, when do you first remember having this feeling that something was happening and that something needed to be done about it?
Actually, I love that phrase because it's been part of my life all the way along. My earliest memories are when I was a little girl and I really wanted to go down to Selma to do the march on Selma and with my church. And of course, I was told I was too young and it was too dangerous and all that. But that got me really interested in learning all about the issues. And the next impetus was when I was in my wheelchair and I would try to stay in Harvard in my classes in a wheelchair, and the professor refused to move the class from the 3rd floor. So I dragged my chair and me up the stairs and came in, and he said, "You're too late." So the next class, all the students were waiting outside to have the class on the lawn. And at both of those times, I said, something needs to get done so that this doesn't happen. And then I decided that disability advocacy was really important because there's a whole group of marginalized people that need to feel included and need some protection. So I think that disability advocacy sort of came as a normal outgrowth of my passion to make things different in the world.
It's really interesting. In a prior speaker series, we were talking to the author, Lisa Levenstein, in a book called They Didn't See Us Coming, Hidden Feminism of the 1990s. And I encourage people to check out that recording. But she talked about about how advocates got to the Human Rights Convention in Beijing and saw that people who were in wheelchairs, there was no provision for them whatsoever. The only answer was for people to pitch in and help carry each other up and down this very long staircase because no one had made any accommodations, and how moving it was to see people who'd never met all see that same experience you're describing as a student and realizing not just for themselves, but for each other, they needed to have something done. When you look across your professional life, you have a great deal of experience in the area of mental health, something that has been itself made more visible in our community and in our country. Thinking about the new mental health 911 type of system. When you're in that part of your practice, where do you see moments where you feel something must be done today, and how do you take action?
Well, that's every day in mental health. I have always been an advocate for deinstitutionalization, community integration, and consumer empowerment. And those were not very popular ideas until maybe about 10, 15 years ago. And now people are a little bit more on board with that. When I was working at the state hospital, it was very moving to me to have worked with a person for 3 years and then not see them for about 5 years and then have them come back as a peer advocate and work side by side with me. That just felt terrific. But I think that something must be done to the system. There are too many gaps in the system. There's too many people waiting for hospital beds. At my current job, which I've only been at since April, I was hired to help create a specialized behavioral health pod within the emergency room because the emergency room can be so daunting to psychiatric patients. And so it's really been interesting to try to get the system to accept that there might be alternatives to hospitalizations, that there might be ways to make safety plans, and that we might be able to do something different than what they're used to doing. So In the state hospital, I would really had a lot of time to make things change. It's very much operates with red tape. And I was really impressed by the patients. I call them my profiles in courage, because there were often skills that nobody was looking at that they could use to get better. And so I was part of the arts and healing programs, where we brought in artists to help people heal. And that was very powerful and interesting, because people never really were thought of as anything other than a patient. And so they would forget all their other roles. They're being a parent, being a child, being a mother, being a worker. All of those roles were different, and patient role is not a very pleasant role to be in all the time. So it's not always popular though, to try to get things done. I kind of think of it as you're trying to eat soup with a fork. Sometimes you get not much, but with tenacity, you can get something. But every effort feels really important. And I realized that it's not really a goal, but a process. And you have to hang in there and work the process before anything gets done.
It's so interesting when you're talking about making change or change makers not always being celebrated. However, you definitely are very appreciated here in Lexington for your efforts for moving things forward, and even where it isn't always successful, in raising awareness of ways that we could do better. One thing I think many of us on the screen and probably watching again on tape feel is that when you've stood up in town meeting and you express, hey, this is something that is going to impact some people in a difficult way. This is not necessarily an improvement for everybody. It does help people realize that when a whole community can participate, everybody can participate, we all benefit. So in Lexington, what propelled you to first get involved, with your town's decision-making and your town's policy-making? Did you move here and unpack your boxes and think, sign me up? Or did that get sparked in some way?
Well, before I moved to Lexington, I was already involved in a community outreach project in Lexington, which was setting up a monthly meal for mentally ill people. And that's now going strong after 38 and a half years every month. So I was already involved on a kind of a community level, but I went to a public meeting in about 2000 where the library renovations were up for debate. And I'm very thankful to Cary Library from that point in time. But I did attend this meeting, and the debate was whether or not the front door should be accessible. So I stood up and said I was really tired of always going to the back door due to disability. And a woman on the panel running the meeting said she would rather hobble up the stairs than ruin the front door of a building near the Battle Green. So I sort of swallowed hard, raised my hand again, and stood up and said, well, some people don't have the choice to hobble. And I was very encouraged because the library staff definitely supported me, and the front door was chosen. But then I said, something must be done. I said, I've got to find out what I can do to work with people in the town so that we can get a little further. And so I joined the enablement committee, which I don't like that title, but anyway, it's now called the Commission on Disability. So I've been doing that for years.
So I know Matthew has ready for us a link, and I want to do one more thing, and then I want to bring in Lotte Scharfman's experience here and Margaret Coppe. The town, just so everyone who's listening knows, the town's website has clear, accessible information for all residents about the different committees. There's more than 70 committees of volunteers in our town helping focus on specific areas. So the Commission on Disability information is available on the website, and Matthew's going to click us over to what's called the charge. The charge outlines what is the role of the specific committee, and we won't take the time to read through it right now, but I wanted people to see this is accessible. And also Matthew's going to put the links right there in the chat bar. Which reminds me, if you have any questions while we're listening to Victoria or Margaret, please pop them into the chat bar. We would really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Matthew. Victoria, can you just sort of summarize for us, what do you see as the core work of the commission?
Well, one interesting point about the commission as opposed to other committees is that we are appointed directly by the town manager, and we're subject to general law of Massachusetts. So it's a little bit different than just a committee. So I think the core of the charge is that we really want to make sure that people with any type of disabilities are treated fairly and equitably. And the town policies need to be inclusive and accessible. And so when I say accessible, people sometimes only think about the physical accessibility, but it's much broader than that. It needs to be programmatic and universal accessibility. So to me, that means education, collaboration, advocacy, and recommending, followed by more education, collaboration, advocacy, and recommending. And it's one of the key things, I think, is interacting with different parts of the town government and the committees and commissions so that we can make sure to protect everybody's rights. Because if we are not, we say that we're a town where everybody belongs. And so I think we need to make sure that we're making that possible for everybody.
Fantastic. And we're going to come back to Victoria, but I'd like to now reintroduce Margaret. Margaret is here, and we are so happy that Lotte Scharfman was brought to our attention. Both LexSeeHer Steering Committee and also the Girl Scouts were really inspired to learn about her life. And we're indebted to Margaret for taking the time to research her and bring forward much more information for us. And then we'll discuss how she truly has a legacy that lives on with us in Lexington. Margaret, thank you.
Thank you, Jessie. This will be a little bit different than Victoria's talk, because I'm going to be talking about, not about me, but about Lotte. So it'll sound a lot different. I want to thank the LexSeeHer for establishing this program and for considering our nomination of Lotte. I also thank Carey Library for sponsoring today's program. And as an aside here to Victoria, talking about accessibility, I know that in my involvement in town, in the beginning, that was never considered. Now it is. Everybody always says, has the Disability Committee weighed in on whatever project we're talking about? And I especially wanted to mention that in the library, when the library renovated and opened up with the large meeting room, the League of Women Voters was immediately said, we've got to do our programs there, because we were doing our programs in people's homes, which were not always accessible to handicapped people. And there's a psychological barrier for new people to go into a strange person's home for a program. Whereas if you have the program at the public place, the library, people will come to it more. It's easier psychologically to go to a public building. So there's lots of facets to accessibility that we became aware of. So Lotte Scharfman, never in all her 42 years was she without purpose. Never was that purpose selfish. The words of Rabbi Herbert Rosenblum at her funeral service in 1970, which was attended by Governor Sargent and other state leaders. She was eulogized in the Boston Globe in a time when words like involvement, commitment, and concern are rather lightly tossed about. Lotte Scharfman represented the real thing. When Lotte Scharfman was 10 years old, she and her family fled the Nazis from her native Austria, and after a brief stay in England, came to the United States. It was an experience she never forgot. Perhaps that is why democracy is more important to me, she once said. I know what can happen if citizens cease to be diligent. Her sense of civic involvement led her to join the local League of Women Voters in 1955, as it stood for the values she held dear, democracy and freedom. She was president of the Lexington League. She served on the State Board League, and then was finally elected president of the State Board League in 1969. I found a document in the League archives that contained her words to Lexington Town Meeting in March of 1965. The League of Women Voters of Lexington is grateful for this opportunity to speak briefly in support of Article 70, calling for the hiring of professional consultants to help the town formulate a long-range financial and land use plan. Some things never change. She went on to describe how the League, through study and research, had arrived at this position. Article 70 asked for $12,000. It passed unanimously. Incidentally, there were 86 articles on the 1965 town warrant. On being elected president of the State League, she addressed multiple issues that she was taking on: housing, juvenile justice, wetland management, reforming civil service, and more. She was grateful to the League for giving her a complete political education and calls it a marvelous teacher. Tragically, in 1970, on her 42nd birthday, she died. She had worked on the initiative to reduce the size of the Massachusetts House from 240 to 160 members, and had returned from a dinner lobbying David Bartley, then Speaker of the House. She did not live to see the change that she and other League members worked hard to bring about. That did not happen until 1978. The following, thanks to Donna Hooper, is from a congressional record of the House of Representatives, January 20th, 1970. She was a rare and special person, one of the few women who can reconcile intelligence and wit with a feminine gaiety that lightened the lives of those around her. She was a lady. Mrs. Howard Scharfman, and I do think it's interesting that in 1970, women were still being referred to with their husbands' names. President of the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts sounds formidable, and she was. She was also Lotte to all kinds and conditions of men and women who fought with her and for her politically, and unanimously respected her honesty and dedication. She was smarter than most of the people she talked with, but she never made them conscious of it. She was utterly fair and so honest as to care deeply about the precise meaning of her words. At the time of her death, she was approaching the critical struggle of the League's long fight to reduce the size of the House of Representatives. She said she thought the League was going to win, and you knew she meant it because she always meant it. She was a politician in the best sense of the word, and her word was good. Speaker David Bartley, her constant adversary in the fight, said of her, she was a dedicated and diligent person, and the League and Massachusetts are poorer. I had the opportunity to talk to two people in Lexington who worked with her and remember her well. The first was Natalie Riffin, the second woman elected to the Board of Selectmen, as it was then called, and one of the speakers at her funeral. She remembered her coming into her room, her red hair flying, with her beliefs that while change takes time, it has to have a beginning. Natalie said that she was in a state of shock when she heard of her death. Fern Abrams was her neighbor and friend. She recalls Lotte as very smart and efficient. She did not waste time. She was a kind and thoughtful person who kept going, even though she did have health issues that eventually led to her death. Her enduring legacy lives on in the League of Women Voters Lotte E. Scharfman Memorial Fund, known as the LWVMA Citizen Education Fund, and in the phrase she is credited with authoring, "Democracy is not a spectator sport." Thank you.
Margaret, thank you so much. It's incredibly helpful to paint a picture of this individual person and what a deep, lasting impact she's had. I wanted to then play on this theme of democracy not being a spectator sport, which feels just like the complement to the something must be done, and go back to Victoria with a follow-up question and then to Margaret. Victoria, in terms of the commission, you helped us understand what is the basic charge, what is the basic work. This idea that democracy is not a spectator sport, how does that land on you, given the work that you've done and the fact that you are on a commission, as you noted, rather than a committee that has a state charge? We hear Lotte was very aware that to effect change, she had to think about not just Lexington, but also the state government and that interplay. How does that come out for you?
Well, I think that that one of the biggest the biggest drawbacks when people are trying to get involved and become civically minded and engaged is that they need education. You know, what is going on? What are the issues? Can we look at this from a different perspective? And I think that that is key in the work of the commission, that we need to collaborate with others, that we need to hear other points of view, and we need to make sure that our points of view are offered in a way that people can understand. For instance, there's a lot of misinformation about disabilities. Everybody, it's not really like you can talk about one big group of disabilities, because everybody's really unique. And so it's very important to get understanding all the individual concerns and issues, so that we can really try to accommodate everybody. So I think that that's really important. We work directly with the MAAB, the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board. So for instance, when a project comes into Lexington, and they need to present it to us, and we need to make recommendations to the MAAB as to whether or not we think a variance is reasonable or not. They've been very helpful when we've had businesses come to us saying that they can't get rid of a step or something going into the building. That's been an important step. And long before I was a town meeting member, I felt like I was at town meeting all the time anyway, the old moderator used to look in the back corner of the room to see whether or not I was there whenever anything was brought up. So I think that being able to give advice and be proactive instead of reactive. Certainly when we started, we were always reactive. It was something we never knew when anything was happening until it was almost done or it was starting. And it really, if we step in a little earlier, it's much better. And we can educate people better that way. I don't know if that answered your question, but
it does. And I think, Margaret, you really brought that in so nicely to reflect on what kind of changes we've seen even in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. And I wonder if you could pull out more, because you've got that perspective looking at it as a town meeting member and someone who's involved in the league, thinking all the time about state and national impacts.
I'm trying to figure out exactly how to answer that. One of the things I'd like to talk about is some of the actions that the local league took in Lexington that people may not even know we were the ones responsible for. So for example, in the 1960s, Marge Batten, the late great moderator, she was the head of the study that came forward with the what was called the Board of Select Board Town Manager Act that we are now governed under. And what she said, the quote that I found was that she said that under the older system, which was up to the 1960s, it was a board of selectmen, 5 volunteers who met on Monday nights to oversee a $12 million budget. And that was not sustainable. So, I think, I didn't know how it was before, because I've always been under the select board town manager form of town government. So Marge was really quite instrumental. It was very well known around the state for her role in that, and then for her role as a moderator. She was highly respected. In the 1980s, we had a president named Judy Marshall, and she worked with Kathy Abbott and Joan Clark. And these are all people, most of them are still around, who started the first household hazardous waste day, and then the first recycling curbside pickup. And they worked hard on that. And then another little known one was a woman named Mila Cabot-Zen, who worked very hard on getting the state law passed on let me think about it again. I've got it right here. The integrated pest management programs that I now see Wilson Farms touts all the time that they do, which promotes alternatives to pesticides and also regulates pesticide use in town buildings and schools. And that was Myla Kabat-Zinn was a driving force through the league for that. And in fact, Governor Paul Cellucci came to Lexington and signed that bill at the nursery school over on Mass Ave. I forget the name of it, but so that's how important it was that Lexington was involved. So we have a long history locally. On the state and national level, I can't even begin to go into the things that the league has sponsored in its 100 years of history. So yes, but they never do it without educating themselves, studying the issue, and coming to consensus. And I think that's something a lot of people don't understand, consensus. It's not, we don't vote on what we're going to do. You come to consensus, and it's a long process. But as someone once said, whatever we do, it's not as long as the 57 years it took to get the right for women to vote.
This is so true. And we would love to have you come back and talk more about the history. My understanding is that the second Lexington suffragist organization that was active right around the 1913, 1920 period, that when they closed their books after the 19th Amendment passed, they were the same people who began the league. So I think we've got a deep connection to explore there. Some of those activists felt, the work wasn't done just because you got the vote. There was much more work to be done. And it is an unending process. I'm wondering, Victoria, two things. One is following up on what Margaret raised. Does the commission use consensus? How do you reach decisions? And what kinds of positive changes do you feel the commission's been able to support recently?
We definitely work under consensus because each of us brings a different perspective to the discussion. Some of the things that we've been able to do was, one of the most important was to pass the full inclusion resolution in town meeting, which means that we expect town policies to reflect accessibility in terms of programmatic and physical and all types of accessibility. So I think that we also have been better at the building commissioner is on with us at our meetings, and that's been very helpful because he brings the new plans in for new buildings so that we can take a look at them and say, well, why is this entrance not level? Is there a way that we can change this? I think that's what is important. Certainly the recreation department has been working well with us. It's really nice to be able to see so many playgrounds that are now accessible. They've been working on them. And the Conservation Commission is about ready to launch Parker Meadow as our first fully accessible conservation area. So we're very excited about that. I think that's even in the middle of October that will be announced. So I think it's really getting out there and telling people what's going on and trying to figure out what's going on. We also were pleased when LexSeeHer came to us for recommendations about their siting of the monument. And we enjoyed the reciprocity of trying to work that out with the artist. I think it's a lot of consensus. And as Margaret said, that I think that what she said that was really important is that that's not fast. That's a process. And you sometimes have to really go after what other people are thinking instead of, just ignoring it. We certainly have, I've learned a lot about sensory issues of hearing issues as well as sight issues because of people on the commission. Who have been able to bring that perspective to us. I also have had we've had a really good relationship over time with DPW, with David Pinsino and John Livesey. And we feel pretty comfortable going to them with any kind of issues that we have. And they're pretty prompt in responding. So that's been good.
You're both really bringing out that theme that I think is underlying what is a benefit of getting engaged civically, is that exchange of ideas, seeing a problem from different people's perspectives. And I know you both integrate that in your own service in the community. And clearly Lotte also did that. Victoria, definitely for LexSeeHer, for those who are listening, the monument includes this bronze gate, and it rests on a granite round circle shaped plaza. And the plaza was designed by Meredith Bergman, the artist, to reflect a spinning wheel shape. And it was incredible, not quick, but really important conversation when the design first came to the commission. And some commissioners pointed out that it was visually, I'm going to use the word busy or noisy, for someone who has brain dysfunction to see a lot of lines on the surface where they need to step and walk across, that it could really actually be very unwelcoming. And so that feedback was taken back to the artist. It did take time. The design was revised to simplify the lines, and that back and forth definitely made the project better. But it's something that the artist couldn't get to on our own, and we certainly couldn't get to without that expertise. But I think you're both really hitting on the process of back and forth and being open. If the town didn't have that process, one wonders, where would we be? The library probably wouldn't be so accessible, as Margaret pointed out, and it wouldn't have brought an opportunity to have the league meetings at the library. I'm curious about, Margaret, maybe from your perspective, you sat in town meeting when you're hearing these different proposals. You mentioned that now we're a town where we expect to be inclusive and we expect to hear from the commission. How about in terms of Lotte's work with civic engagement? What kind of changes do you see in terms of what people expect from residents? Do you feel like people are more engaged now than they were 10 or 15 years ago? Less engaged? What kind of changes do you see? It's a very personal question, I realize, but I'm going to ask you the same thing, Victoria.
I would say that. And I think it's a historical phenomenon. I think the group of women that I mentioned by name, being Lotte Scharfman, and I could name a whole lot of them, and you probably know a lot of them. They're still around. They're still in Lexington. They got active on things. Natalie Riffin was the first woman elected to the planning board. She's at Brookhaven right now. But there weren't many avenues for the women of that time to use their brains and their education. Many of them were highly educated, but they didn't work outside the house, outside the home. And the league provided an enormous benefit to them in terms of the intellectual stimulation and the learning, and then teaching us how to go about getting things done. Some of you may remember an old friend of mine, Peg Bradley. And Peg was very active in the league, and she taught me how to go to a meeting when you're going into a meeting to get information from officials somewhere. She said, you always take 3 people. You take the person who's going to ask the questions. You take the second person who's going to take notes, and you take the third person to just sit there. And I said, what? She says, because the people on the other side have no idea why that third person is there. And, that was, I don't know, that was official league training, but it certainly is the kind of mentoring that you get when you deal with groups like this. So I do want to tell you a brief anecdote about accessibility that I experienced when I was on the school committee. I got a phone call from a citizen, a gentleman who wore hearing aids. And they had moved his grandson's 8th grade graduation from Clark Middle School to the high school auditorium because the classes were so big with all the parents and that. And he had inquired ahead of time about the assisted listening devices, but got no response, nothing. He goes, he can't hear any of the ceremony. So he calls me, and I said, you're right. Okay. So I called the appropriate person at the high school. And I think that person was already waiting for my call, quite frankly. And I said, you've got to have the assisted listening devices. And they didn't want to do it. I said, what do you mean you don't want to do it? I said, you have to do it. It's ADA compliant. You have to do it. Well, where are we going to keep them? And what if somebody steals? I see, Victoria, you get this all the time, I bet, don't you? Yeah. And I finally said, look, we have them at town meeting. We have them in the selectman's office. Nobody steals these things. What are you worried about? and I don't know. So I have to confess, I don't know what happened after that. But what struck me was the reluctance, and that was, when was I on the school committee in 20?
Recently, I mean, it's only been, you've been off for 5 years, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that the reluctance when it was brought to their attention to do it, and that there's still a lot of work to do.
Victoria, we do see that all the time. I know that my son was in elementary school at Hastings, and a child had a very bad accident and was in a wheelchair from age 6 on, and the town didn't do anything about addressing the playground at all. So I was on the PTA at the time with a group of other volunteers, and we raised money and we addressed the playground because it seemed cruel and heartless to have a playground where someone now couldn't use any of the equipment that was there at all. None, zero, nothing was accessible. But we did do something, and the town at least allowed us to do it. So that was good, because we had to also have those meetings to ask to get to do it. Victoria, it's sometimes so incredibly frustrating, just the way Margaret described it very politely, but it's really frustrating to be in that situation of asking for something state law tells you you have a right to, but people simply do not want to do it. They don't want to. How do you advise people to keep going? Because it's, if you're the one who's asking for yourself or a loved one, it's really demoralizing and deflating.
I like that theory of bringing 3 people in. but
It works.
but I would say that what is most important is, especially for town residents, is that they realize that they can go to the Human Rights Committee, they can go to Commission on Disability, that they don't have to go after this alone, and that that you really need to not just come in and say, well, this is the law, this is the ADA, but give them an example of what could be done. Give them an accommodation idea, maybe even spec it out in terms of how much you think it would cost them. To see whether or not there is the reluctance is because they just don't know. Maybe it's ignorance. I always say ignorance is a handicap, but it doesn't entitle you to park here. My husband had to keep me from putting those on cars. But sometimes people just don't know, and other times they know, but I don't know how we're going to do this. So I think that it's important to make sure that people see some of the solutions and not just the complaint. And I think the other thing that happens, especially with CPAC or some of the parent advisory groups, when they're advocating for children with disabilities, is that it is very emotional. And it is very hard to hear people say, well, that's only one kid, don't worry about that. And so it's important to have some advocates with you to focus on really what needs to get done.
I just wanted to throw out a quick thing in response to Victoria. As you may know, I spent many years as a biology teacher at Wakefield High School. And towards the end of my career, we had a young lady in a motorized wheelchair. And before she even came to the high school, and the school was an older, was a building from the 60s and 70s. Her mother came with her and went around the science department to make sure that she could access the department, like the lab benches and stuff, because we didn't have the modern lab benches that had a lower place for someone in a wheelchair. The school then went and renovated all of the labs so that for the next 4 years, she could use any, and it wasn't just one lab, they did all of them, because you never knew where she was going, where her class was going to meet, where was she going to be assigned. And that's an important concept, because people don't realize that if you just renovated one of them, then she'd always have to be in that room with a teacher, and it may not be the best fit for her, so we did all that. And and she's a very successful young woman, and she's still in her motorized wheelchair. I see pictures of her on Facebook every so often, but she but the school, so then it became her senior year, and she was going to do a lab practical in her anatomy class, and that the guy laid it all out on the lab benches, and then the kids went from station to station to answer the questions. But she couldn't do that because it wasn't the facility. They weren't all low benches, they were all high benches. And so his solution was, well, he'd have her come after school and he'd set it up in a different room, And the principal said, no, can't do that. You have to set it up in a different room for everybody. And that was, I think for a lot of people, very eye-opening, that the approach. And I will tell you, I had a very good principal.
And that leads me into some questions. And I want to remind people who are listening, please add questions to the chat bar if you have them, or you can raise your hand, whatever you like. But on that note, for both of you, you've balanced family and full-time jobs and also civic engagement. So if you have thoughts, I'll go to you, Margaret, first, and then Victoria. What are some strategies for weaving civic engagement into our busy lives?
I view it as choice. It's something I choose to do. And if I want to do it, then I make it work. It was not always easy. And it meant there were probably things maybe that I didn't do because of that, but it wasn't, you can't do it all. That's a myth that you can do it all. You can't, but it was choice. And I said, this is important to me and I will make the time for this. And that's what I did.
How about you, Victoria? Strategies, struggles, tips?
I think it is a problem of time management, but it's also, you need to follow your passions. And so when you're passionately feel like you need to be an advocate, you do that. And also when my kids were growing up, I would bring them with me. I would have them volunteer with me someplace so that they could learn a little bit about what was going on as well. But it's tiring. And you have to be able to say no, which I'm not terribly good at. And you have to be able to figure out what is the biggest priority. So I think it's tough, but I think it's really worth it, because if you jump in and add your own interests and expertise to a town project, say, you really end up feeling like you get some satisfaction out of it. I always say, dare to eat the soup with the fork for a while, because over time your efforts will bear you fruit and satisfaction, and it does take a while.
And I was also a lot younger at the time. That made it easier, I will tell you. But some of these things you really need to have a lot of stamina for. Especially town meeting.
It's true. You both worked on personally, and Lotte certainly did. And as you mentioned, Margaret, Marge Batten certainly did, all work on really big problems where you're working on a smaller piece at a time. I'm wondering for both of you, and Victoria, I'll go to you first, as you sort of look back, what are some things that you're feeling most proud of? And then also, if you had a magic wand right now today, and you could get one project done, what would that be?
I guess, you mean in Lexington?
It could be anywhere. It could be anywhere, but I'm curious about Lexington, but I'm also now curious about where else.
Let's see, I think I'm the most proud of the fact that the commission has become more visible and that people come to us more often for advice, and that they connect us with things other than just sidewalks. Because I swear when that was all going on, I'd stand up in town meeting and they go, oh, no sidewalks. Anyway, but I also, in terms of the streetscape, we're working really hard with them to make sure that we get what we were promised, which was a very smooth surface. So there's already a punch list out there that they're working on for that. I'd say that on a personal level, I think that what I'm most proud of is being able to bring up my kids in a school system that accepted them as being some special needs as well as adopted. And I did start the diversity book bags back then. So that was another accomplishment that I liked. Certainly, when I go to Uganda, I feel like I'm making a difference with disabled children who have been stuck in their huts for 7 years, and we're getting them out and in therapy and in school. So I think that's important work.
How about you, Margaret? Things that you're feeling either most proud of, in terms of sort of Lottie's lasting legacy on the league and your involvement with the league, let's look at it from that lens first.
Ooh, you're putting me on a hot spot. I haven't thought about it in terms of the league. In terms of, in general, I think it's been that I started in town meeting in 1982. So I'm coming up to my 40th anniversary, guys.
Wow.
I know. And it was the support of the league and other people in town, but you know, that really helped. And it was my understanding and then I ran for town meeting in 1983 was my first year to be elected to town meeting. And why I did it was because I began to see that if I wanted to support education in town, I could do more in town meeting than I could do in any PTA. You know, the PTAs do a lot and they're fine, but they couldn't bring in the big money. On the school committee, I think my proudest thing is when we finally got to open the new Estherbrook. That was such a wonderful school. And looking forward, I hope we get a new high school before I die.
Victoria, is there that magic wand thing? I don't know if you got to answer that one. If you could just get one thing, move forward, really anywhere, what that might be.
I would love to see the rates of suspension in the schools even out. It's still shocking to me that there are so disparate and they're so weighted against the children with disabilities and children of color, never mind the intersection of those two groups. And I find it very disturbing in a town that says they value equity and inclusion, that we can't seem to get this straightened out. That's my magic wand for Lexington. But that's something I'm really concerned about.
Margaret, do you have a magic wand?
Well, just the new high school.
The new high school. Okay, that is actually a big one. That's a tall order, but we're working on it.
Well, and I would like it to be in time for my two grandsons to at least set foot in it while they're 8 and 12. So I don't know if they're going to make it.
It's really just terrific being able to take some time and think about it. The last question I really had that I'd like to close on, but again, if anyone has questions, please pop them in the chat bar, is LexSeeHer has put a focus on gender and thinking about the role that women have played in our community. I'm just curious if there's ways that you feel like gender has impacted your work, either given you different challenges than you think you would have had if you were a man, or if you think that there's special strengths you brought to your work because you're a woman. Either of those would be interesting. I won't call on you. I'll let whoever feels like they have something to say go first.
Well, I think it's a very different society than when I was a teenager. And I think that women have become more, I mean, that tells you how old I am, but anyway, but I think that women have been more listened to than they were in the past. I think that sometimes being a woman can be frustrating if you're trying to be a leader or you're trying to influence change. Sometimes I think that they will more likely to listen to a male. But I also think that women bring a different type of compassion and passion to any kind of issue, and that certainly the ability to do more than one thing at a time is certainly something that women do better than men. I should probably not make that statement. Now everybody will be after me. But anyway, I think the flexibility and resiliency of women sort of makes them able to see a different side of things.
Well, when I got in town meeting, it was still heavily male.
Oh.
And I used to count. You know, those boring times when you'd sit there and I would count, and it was really pretty obvious. That has changed, you know. But when I think back to these women, you know, people like Lotte in her time, they were beacons. They were out there by themselves most of the time. You know, I mean, for how many years have we had a select board or a planning board? And we can point now to a living woman who was the first one elected to the planning board. It tells you, you know, and it's better now. It is definitely better. When I was taking a psychology course with Carol Gilligan, she did a whole thing about the difference in moral decisions by males and females. And males are very rule bound and females try to include everybody. They have very different presented problems. You know, they tend to do that. So, and I've noticed that, but in 1991, eight of our league board members chaired all the major boards in Lexington. They were the chairs of the school committee, appropriation, planning board, conservation commission, board of selectmen, town moderator, capital expenditures, and housing authority. I don't think it's happened since then, but I think once you do that, then it becomes easier and more accepted for people to make those steps. But I still look at pictures and see predominantly male faces.
That's so great. I want to thank everyone so much for coming. I want to touch on one little note that Margaret made me think about, which is for people who are not aware, you can go to LexSeeHer.com and you can learn more about the women in the monument. And it does include Marge Batten, whose name was brought up today. She was a long-standing moderator, and she was chosen for her leadership as a moderator also because, as Margaret shared, she was instrumental in having the town manager selectman agreement act, which really did change the way our town government worked, and many feel for the better. And she also was recognized at the state level as a moderator by the Massachusetts Moderators Association. So you can learn more about her, and she stands on the other side of the monument from Ruth Morey, who was the town's first female select board member, and also was the president of the Historical Society. They're not the focus of today, so I won't go further, but you'll find if you participate in our speaker series that usually one series event to the next, we start learning and putting together the connection between many, many important women in our community whose contributions and stories may not be familiar. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you'll tune in October and November as we continue celebrating and taking a closer look at the 2022 Women's Visibility Banner honorees. We thank again the Girl Scout troops who have made the banners possible. And Margaret, Victoria, thank you for sharing your expertise today. We celebrate Lotte Scharfman. Margaret, thank you so much to the League for bringing her forward. That quote, "Democracy is not a spectator sport," should be on all of our minds as we head into election season. And thank you so much, Matthew, to you and everyone at Cary Library, to Helen, who's not with us today, but Helen Liu helped organize. And I hope everyone has a fantastic day. Matthew, we'll send it back over to you.
Thank you, Jesse. I just want to say, lastly, just thank you to Victoria and Margaret and Jesse. And we'll send out the recording in the next coming days. And thank you again for taking time today.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Great day.